Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. My guest for this episode is Dr. Michael Woodward, who is the Clinical Assistant Professor of Executive Coaching at NYU, where he leads the Masters of Science program in Executive Coaching and Organizational Consulting. He's also a best-selling author whose latest book is titled The Digital Coaching Revolution. In this episode, we explore the three waves of digital coaching disruption, examining how technological advancements have revolutionized the way coaching is delivered and received. We look at various digital coaching platforms and providers, shedding light on their unique approaches and innovations. And we also dive into the democratization of coaching, showcasing how these digital tools have opened the doors to professional guidance for a wider audience. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Welcome to the program, Woody.
Oh, it's great to be here as always, Charles. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start with just kind of these three waves of digital coaching. That first wave you mentioned is really attributed to the sports industry. We'll get into some of the lessons learned from the sports industry later. The second wave of disruption occurred in healthcare and well-being, also a chapter in your book, which we can unpack a little bit later. But the third wave is kind of what you're looking at now, and that's the focal point of taking place in the professional and executive coaching industry. Tell us a little bit more about this third wave that's happening right now.
Yeah, so when we look at executive coaching in particular, and if we just focus here in the US, you know, probably 80s into the 90s, we saw it become sort of popular for the C-suite. So senior executive leaders, typically those who had challenges or derailment concerns, right? They would bring in usually psychologist types who had kind of morphed into the coaching space, or a lot of sort of business guru types, right? Who would come in and started doing work with these folks. And then what we saw was a sort of professionalization with a lot of the consulting firms developing coaching practices, because they found as consultants they came in, they started sort of transitioning into that role of coach as opposed to just being a consultant, um, working on business issues, but working on the interpersonal challenges of the executives. So we saw that that's been around for a while. It's nothing new. You know the Marshall Goldsmiths of the world, right? Famed executive coaches, PDRIs, and even now Korn Ferry, and a lot of these Center for Creative Leadership, which has been around since the 70s, right? Have all had these offerings for quite some time. But what we saw is going into the pandemic, it really awakened this challenge that we've always known we've had with leaders at all levels, right? They really struggle. They don't get a lot of training, and the training they get isn't always that helpful, right? It's classroom based, it's very generic, it's one size fits all, and then they go back and they don't know what to do with that, right? So going into the pandemic, we had not just leaders or line leaders, supervisors, managers, but individual contributors all really struggling, whether it was the isolation, the disconnection, adapting to working from home while managing the home, kids at home, right? Elderly parents, their own health challenges. And then on top of that, those who had to get out and work and adjust to distancing rules or using personal protective equipment and how to stay safe, right? Concerns around vaccines and what does that mean, right? And so, layers and layers of emotional labor piled onto folks, and leaders just didn't know what to do and how to deal with it. So when people are dispersed and we can't really come together, what we found is they needed coaches. They needed someone to lean on to talk through their challenges and help guide them in the right direction, and help them figure out what to do and how to deal with these challenges. So lo and behold, the digital coaching platforms were there. BetterUp's been around since 2013. You have Bravely, I think, not too long after that. Um, Ezra, Valence, some of these companies, they were there. They'd been around. And so they started to realize, hey, these are services that can help in a time where that's just unprecedented, where people need that one-to-one kind of bespoke support. And they could offer that at a scale that we hadn't seen before with the boutique providers, the consulting firms at very high prices, or just individual contractor coaches, which is really how most coaches operate. So they were able to wrangle pools of coaches and manage and offer those services through L&D or HR departments. And what we found is that kind of support had typically been reserved for like employee assistance programs, which rose more to the level of therapeutic or mental health interventions. And most of what we saw didn't rise to that, right? And so, how did you fill that space? And that's what the digital coaching providers filled. So, it, that's where we got to it, right post pandemic is we found this value and need for coaching services. And I think, Charles, that's really informed where the space has gone since then.
Since we emerged from the pandemic 2022, a new challenge arose, right? The return to work. So the coaching profession began to shift from helping people manage remote work in isolating circumstances to now really dealing with the challenges of returning to social workspaces. Employees were exhausted from their workloads, the quiet quitting phenomenon, the great resignation. So digital coaching began to position themselves now as a help in that way, but also position their services as a tool for engaging talent in as far as to retain that talent, correct?
Yeah, no doubt. And look, right, we had great resignation, quiet quitting, a lot of other variations on disengagement, right, and withdraw. And what's interesting is the work from home or remote work or hybrid work concepts, we're still kind of grappling with those today. And in places like Europe, parts of Asia, people have pretty much fully gone back, right? We're really one of the only holdouts is the US. And I think that's actually a good thing because in my opinion, it would just be such a terrible waste of learning from what happened during the pandemic to just flip the switch and try to turn the clock back to late 2019 early 2020. I think would just be a really really unfortunate waste, and it would be a demonstration of a true lack of learning of business leaders and policymakers in this country without question. So the real answer is it's not one size fits all. No question about it. There are certain types of work that really require people to be there physically. Certain types of work we found never required people to be there physically. It was more, the narcissism of a leader and the need to have people around me and feel like validated. So, you know, we're sorting that out still. I think we have come to some healthy um, arrangements in a lot of industries where we're just being practical now, as opposed to trying to force poorly thought out policies that just didn't adjust with the time. So there's no question about it, but coaches are still very important and coaching still plays a critical role in leadership because Charles, as you know, in your life's work, leaders struggle a lot because they just don't get the support they need. They get either elevated because of they've emerged as being great at what they do. I'm a great salesperson. I'm a great engineer. I'm a great retailer. Well, okay. Does that mean you're great at leading others doing that? Probably not. More often it's the opposite, right? So, how do we help support those transitions and challenges that have always been there, even pre pandemic? I think we just became awakened to the idea that coaching could be a service that we just hadn't thought of en masse like we did during the pandemic. So, yes, those work arrangement issues are challenges. Um, but as leaders learn to adjust to the new types of arrangements they need to make, along with the fact that we are truly in a VUCA environment, a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world like we've never seen before with the geopolitical challenges, right? Political issues here around the world, as well as the unprecedented and rapid advances in technology that are at a breakneck pace that we can barely keep up with. So leaders have a lot of challenges, and I think coaches are poised to continue to help those folks.
I'm in agreement with that. The digital coaching revolution, where companies like you mentioned, Better Up, Bravely, Coach Up, Ezra, they're beginning to take shape, but it's not anything new, right? Management consulting firms like Center for Creative Leadership, Korn Ferry, and all of those have been offering these types of services to enterprise clients for quite a while. What's different, I find, about these new firms is they're highly specialized, right? Their focus is really on coaching, and they're leading with coaching as the core solution for professional learning and development, as opposed to the reverse as an ancillary offering or a line item as part of their consulting contract. So talk to me a little bit more about how they digitize the management and delivery of coaching to streamline this process and really create the potential for offering this coaching at scale.
But one thing we've all known, and certainly that I believe as someone who is a longtime executive coach, as well as a coach educator and a thought leader in the coaching space, is that coaching in and of itself, most of the time, isn't the solution. It's coaching woven in to other types of learning modalities, right? So, and I think the digital players knew that early on. So they started to pivot from just being a coaching service provider to being coach led development providers, right? So they started to pivot more into the learning and development space with more robust offerings around their coaching services, where you had like micro learnings, in class learnings, adapting to the competency models of specific companies or organizations and how they weave that into the coaching, customizing the coaching to align with the values and philosophies of an organization and their vision for what they believe in leadership. So there's no doubt that even though the coaching platforms came out very coaching focused, they've slowly, well, maybe not that slowly, they've pretty quickly morphed into being more digital versions of professional services providers um, in the space, but they're able to scale what they do because they are able to have large pools of coaches all around the world and integrate them into their services. Now, the challenge is, of course, when it comes to scaling coaching, is you get quality issues, right? Because you need large numbers of human individual coaches who are qualified to provide the kind of coaching services that these companies are providing. And so that's become a challenge, is how do you maintain a high level of quality of coaches while being able to scale and provide these services en masse, particularly across the organization. So this is where we can get into this in a bit, but this is where that whole democratization of coaching I got very suspicious of early on, because my concern was, if you want to provide coaching for everybody, that's a lot of coaches, and there probably aren't enough well-trained, qualified coaches to actually do that.
Let's get into that movement where you're kind of democratizing coaching. You mentioned three big players: Better Up, Ezra, Coach Up. But you can also kind of break up this industry into general categories of approach of services. So you have the digital coaching platforms, you have the digital coaching and development providers, and then you have the SaaS based management services. So let's talk about each one. And first, let's talk about those digital coaching platforms, which are, Better Up, Bravely, Ezra, Coach Up, and kind of what they offer in this space.
Yeah, I mean, they're licensing models. Most of them have been from the get-go. So you buy licenses as a HR leader, CHRO, or head of a division or a unit, and you're able to dole those licenses out. They have different models and restrictions or non-restrictions on the use of those and how often they can connect with their coaches and use their coaches over like 3 months, 6 month, 9 month periods of time. Um, they offer different types of coaches. Some have specialty coaches, right? Where it's could be your nutrition coach or your sleep coach, and like Better Up Care kind of has a larger suite of offerings. Some of them are very leader and manager development focused. You see ASUP really playing in that space, as well as Ezra, I think, really leaning into the manager leader development, but as well as employee experience space. So there are certainly a lot of different players and offerings out there, but I think they continue to evolve, Charles, based on market demands and the needs of organizations, as well as the budgets of organizations, right? Which is going to dictate the kind of offerings that these providers are going to be able to offer to their clients. So you have those players. An interesting angle that some have taken have been more like the software as a service provider managed services. So although like all those that we've mentioned, all the big players, they'll say they're SaaS, they're software as a service, but they're providing coaching services, and they have human coaches providing services. So I would classify them as service providers with probably some SaaS offerings. Then you have others who are really like your Optify, your coaching.com. I think Delenta is like another one where they're out there saying, hey, look, we'll manage your coaching pools for you. So all your vendors, we could manage through our software programs. We could manage tracking. So if you have your own coaches, we could put them into the system. If you use various vendors, we could put them into the system. Um, Even Corn Ferry has a managed services offering that they offer for managing coaching. Because even to this day, Charles, as surprising as it is in the world we live in with such advanced technology, there are major corporations out there that are managing their coaching offerings through Excel spreadsheets. And I would say that's just probably not the way to go, because we have enough technology out there to help us manage our coaching services in a much more organized and structured way, through technology. So those are kind of the major differences I see. You've got the licensing model. You've got, I think, sort of the professional services approach model, which they're all kind of going towards, or a hybrid of the two. And then you've got like that SaaS, we're just a managed service provider. We'll provide you the software to manage your coaching services, and we'll give you access to pools of coaches that we vet if you need them.
So how are they really democratizing coaching? Building it out at scale, getting all of the leaders involved. I mean, it's really difficult to have something that's scalable, but also is effective and personalized, right? So a lot of these players are trying to find that right balance between the two, so you can bring it from the C-suite down to all levels of the organization, or at least lower than that upper tier of the organization.
Yeah, I never really believed this notion that they were going to democratize coaching. I think that there was just, in the providing any kind of human service where it requires an individual to interact as a professionally trained individual with other folks, whether it's physicians, attorneys, or coaches, right, is very difficult to do. And with large companies that have a couple 100,000 employees, how are you possibly going to provide coaching services for everybody? You're not going to have enough coaches. You're not going to be able to maintain the quality of coaching services. I think it's just always been an uphill battle. I think it's a noble cause, no question about it. So, but the reality is it's been very difficult to do. So I was always skeptical from the get-go when I heard the democratized coaching mantra. And the first year of our summit, everybody was saying it. The second year, people were starting to back off. And now the pendulum has kind of swung back around, because we are able to democratize what I would say is human development services using AI. And so that's a whole different play that we're starting to see emerge really this year, with the proliferation of ChatGPT, the development of various proprietarily trained GPTs or AI coaches. Are It's fascinating what we're seeing coming on. So, can you use AI enabled co-pilots, as some call it, or coach assistants to help scale the ability of human coaches, right, to provide more service with the aid of these tools and technologies, so they're not necessarily spending as much one-to-one time in coaching, but more they are deploying these technologies to help in the space between sessions, or to spread out sessions, or to answer or help with things that may be more automated or routine, that a human coach doesn't have to necessarily be present for or interact with the human coachee on. It's getting very interesting. This is still evolving very, very quickly.
Absolutely. And before we get into the technology, let's talk a little bit about the how do we measure the ROI, and what KPIs are we using in coaching, because that's gained more and more traction as more of these digital coaching providers have come into play. They collect a ton of data. They have a lot of analytics going on. Some of them have even developed labs of their own to try to identify that science and what's the right way to measure these, because you always want to tie it back to business outcomes if you can, that ROI, or identify certain metrics instead of just hours of training and completion rates. Talk about skill acquisition, knowledge retention, behavioral nudges, or and changes. So talk to me a little bit about where that's going and kind of where that current state is to really identify the business impact of these coaching platforms.
Yeah, coaching's always been difficult to measure because it is a one-to-one, mostly confidential interaction between a coach and a coachee, right? Over a period of time. When we talk about big C professional coaching, there's, the engagements go over a period of time, 3 months, 6 months, a year or so, right? With regular intervals of meetings. It could be weekly, monthly, depending on the type of engagement. So it's very difficult to measure, because anything that the coachee is working on, there are so many different forces acting on their jobs and their work environment that influence the kind of variables you would want to measure around impact. So, what the digital coaching providers, I think, came to the table with is the fact that they could measure coaching en masse in ways we hadn't been able to measure before, because they're deploying coaching services to tens, hundreds, thousands of individuals at a time, and they've standardized some of what the coaching services they're providing, and they have similarly trained coaches, right, going in. So now you can kind of measure, you know, in bulk, right, what's going on in coaching. It's still, it's easier to measure, like, satisfaction, um, anything that's self-report oriented, sure. But we know just from training that doesn't really tell you a whole lot, and it certainly tells you nothing about impact, right? Impact on the business or impact on their team members. So now we are able to measure things like the morale of the team or reactions of the team. You can try to look at outcomes like team, if there are specific objective measures of productivity or output. My word of caution there are always other variables at play that you cannot control for in a work environment. Can we do this in randomized controlled trials where we try our best to control for the outside variables, or in lab studies? Sure. Does that always apply to the workplace? Not really, right? So it can be a challenge. So I still don't think we've solved for how do we really tie to business outcomes. It's tough, but because we can measure coaching services at a larger scale now in a more standardized way, we're definitely getting better at it. That's for sure.
I like how you also bring in these adjacent fields that have informed coaching as well, because nowhere has coaching become so enmeshed with technology and analytics and in sports and sports coaching. And it might be very well, right, that sport coaching foreshadowed the technological innovation in coaching techniques in all other coaching domains. So, speak to me a little bit about sports and how that's really informed the technology use in the more professional services coaching domain.
Yeah, I mean, think about it, right? In every sport, you've got uh, tons of technology, in particular video of every game. You're reviewing video. You have different physiological monitoring devices like an aura ring or different heart rate monitors or even your phone, right? I mean, and all these devices that they're using, they're testing because athletes really need to perform at a high level, but they have to be wholly there, right? So it's physically, it's mentally ready and prepared and to perform at their peak. So the sports industry is a great place to learn from. I mean, in all things, even in leadership and how we work with people and teamwork. So there's so much over time we've really taken from sport. Um, what I would say it's really interesting is in sports, it's important to remember that when we refer to a coach in sports, that's very different than a professional coach in the business and work life arena, because in sports the coach also has authority and power, right? So they're more like a leader manager using coaching skills versus what we consider to be a professional coach is more of a guide, an outside person coming in. So I always want to make that differentiation because I there's always a lot of analogies between coaches in sport and coaches in business, and they are very, very different. Um, the way the approach and all that stuff. So just important to keep that in mind. But that said, the technology is amazing. And one that I can talk about that we use at NYU is a platform called Ovida. Full disclosure, I am also an angel investor in Ovida and have been involved with them since very early on. But it was only after I tried it and we tested it with our students that I realized, wow, this is game changing. So what Ovida does, it's an opportunity for coaches to coach a coachee on a video platform. It's no different than what it looks like right now between you and I or a typical Zoom call, but it captures data. And that's what's so important, objective data about what's going on. And what this was inspired by is in sports, say, take tennis, for example. You're going to watch your matches. They're recorded. You're going to look at what happened. You're going to review the data, ball speed, angle, pitch of racket, all those things you're reviewing on a constant basis. In professional coaching, how often are we looking at video of ourselves coaching someone else? Pretty much never, right? So, how do coaches actually improve and get better? There really is no way to do that unless you are actually watching video that captures objective data about the interaction. And that is what is so critically important about the tools and technology we have today that have been inspired by sport. You would never tell an athlete to just reflect on how your game went today, but don't watch any video. Don't look at any data or statistics on how you performed. Just reflect on it. That's what we tell coaches to do. Just reflect on how the session went, and you'll be good. Or work with the supervisor and reflect on it. It's crazy, right? So we're adapting technologies like that, Charles, which are helping us learn like my percent of talk time, my interruption rate, my use of open versus closed questions. And so AI has integrated that into that to capture that data, feed it back to you, and then allow supervisors to get in and provide the human commentary on things that AI just is never going to be able to capture, like certain things you're working on or patterns in an interaction that need to be brought to the awareness of the coach. So yeah, there's so many technologies out there, Charles, that we're seeing integrated into coaching, into human performance, and into learning and development at work that I think are really going to help catapult performance into the future.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.